The famous victory at Midway by the Americans over the Japanese in early June 1942 was one of the great battles in which empires rose and fell on the fate of their ships at sea: the Spanish Armada, Trafalgar, Jutland, Midway. Midway also belongs to a special group of epic sea battles, in which the Western world confronted the expanding forces of Asia, such as at Salamis, Lepanto, Tsushima, and Midway. It is the greatest battle the American Navy has fought, and is rightly celebrated as one of the high points of American arms. So brightly has the victory shone, however, that it has obscured how close the outcome truly was, and how costly were our blunders. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who commanded the American fleet at Midway, understood better than many what had actually taken place. He assessed it accurately when he said, "After a battle is over, people talk a lot about how the decisions were methodically reached, but actually there's always a hell of a lot of groping around." Lord, Incredible Victory 87. That groping around is the raw action of all battles, and at Midway it took some remarkable twists and turns, none more tragic than the great blunders that sent 4 squadrons of unprepared pilots and obsolete torpedo planes against the enemy on June 4, 1942, between the hours of 7 and 11 in the morning. These blunders, the kindest word I can use, are the subject of this book, which will assemble all the pieces for the first time to reveal the total picture and expose the cover-up that concealed what actually happened. One group, Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the Hornet, has been singled out for fame, having only one survivor, the famous Ensign George Gay, who lived until 1995. But there were 3 other American torpedo groups at Midway. Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3, originally a Saratoga squadron flying from the Yorktown. Torpedo Squadron 6, VT-6, from the Enterprise, and a mixed group of torpedo-carrying Army and Navy planes based on Midway Island, which I shall call the Midway Squadron. They went in separately, one squadron after another, on the morning of June 4th. In total, 51 planes tried to hit the Japanese ships with torpedoes that day. Only 7 landed back at base. This resulted in an aircraft loss rate of over 86%. Out of 128 pilots and crew members who were in the torpedo planes that day, 29 survived and 99 died. And not one torpedo exploded against the hull of a Japanese ship. The battle ran on fitfully for 2 more days, but it was all over for the torpedo squadrons shortly after 10:30 a.m. on June 4th, as it was for the Japanese carrier force when our dive bombers reached them a few minutes later. The record is known and honoured, but the full story of what a desperately bad hand the torpedo planes played out to its bitter end has never been assembled as a single narrative. Midway has had its historians, and fine ones too, from Samuel Eliot Morison, Walter Lord, and Gordon Prange to John Lundstrom. But the official version has remained that the torpedo squadrons at Midway were lost making a gallant attack that cleared the upper air of Japanese fighter planes, allowing our dive bombers to come in unopposed and sink the Japanese carriers. This was, unintentionally on anyone's part, admirals or torpedo pilots, a part of what happened. The truth is that these squadrons, like the British Light Brigade at Balaclava in the Crimean War, never had a chance. Our torpedo planes were obsolete, while the Japanese fighters that shot them down were among the best in the world. Our weapon, the Mark 13, Model 1 aerial torpedo, failed to run hot and true much of the time, and when it hit, it often failed to explode. Because of these torpedo deficiencies, a suicidal and counterproductive drop tactic had been developed to try to prevent damage to their working parts. Due to cost-cutting during a time of tight budgets and a torpedo shortage leading up to the war, most of the pilots who flew in the torpedo attack at Midway had never been trained to carry and launch a tin fish. Because of command failures and poor communications, the vulnerable torpedo planes were sent into battle unescorted by fighters, and the enemy was not diverted by simultaneous dive-bombing attacks. None of these failures, I repeat, was intentional. They were the result of bad luck and poor planning, along with an unwillingness to accept and act on the truth about our planes and torpedoes. Instead, people who knew better acted as if everything was all right. These failures in conjunction led to an overwhelming disaster, which, after the battle, was covered up to save careers and avoid tarnishing a major victory at a time when the American public desperately needed good news. Midway was a multi-phase battle fought with complex hardware. Understanding what happened to the torpedo squadrons requires some knowledge of the various elements involved. This information is ancient history by now, but I hope the reader will bear with me as I explain World War II aircraft carriers, airplanes, naval carriers, and torpedoes in order to clarify the fate of the torpedo squadrons. I played a small part in this action, I am proud to say. I was an enlisted man, an aviation ordnanceman, 18 years old, in Torpedo Squadron 6 on board the Enterprise, one of the 3 American aircraft carriers of the Yorktown class that fought the battle and ultimately prevailed. Small as my involvement was, it was sufficient to make me feel that I am fulfilling a duty to my shipmates in recording just how badly things went wrong for the aerial torpedo squadrons that day over the blue waters of the mid-Pacific. Time was a critical factor in the Battle of Midway, as it is in all battles, but here the contestants used different clocks. The Americans operated on Greenwich Zone +10, whereas the Japanese used their Tokyo home port time, Zone +9. Because the battle was fought across the 180th degree of longitude, the international dateline, the antagonists sometimes even used different days of the week and month. In the interest of clarity and consistency, I have silently changed all times in the battle to Midway time, which is Greenwich Zone +12, halfway around the world. The water was covered with oil, fires were still burning, and ships were resting on the bottom mud. Superstructures had broken and fallen. Great gaps loomed where magazines had exploded, and smoke was roiling up everywhere. For sailors who had considered these massive ships invincible, it was a sight to be seen, but not comprehended. As we made our way to a dock on the west side of Ford Island, just beyond the old target battleship Utah turned Turtle, we seemed like mourners at a spectacular funeral. The Navy had assumed that in the event of war, our battle fleet, centered on its massive battleships, would sweep across the Pacific to relieve General Douglas MacArthur and the army in the Philippines. Then, we would beat up on the Japanese Navy and continue on to Tokyo. Something like this had been projected for years in a series of secret war plans brightly labelled Orange and Rainbow, but it was not to be. For the time being, the Navy fought a holding action. The Saratoga was torpedoed in January near the Hawaiian coast, and after that, America, with 2 oceans to fight in, had only 3 carriers in the Pacific, the Enterprise, the Yorktown, and the Lexington, while the Japanese had 6 fleet carriers and a number of smaller ones. It was risky to go anywhere west of Hawaii, and Vice Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, CINC-PAC, played his cards carefully, even after the Yorktown and the brand-new Hornet, sister ships of the Enterprise, came around from the Atlantic. There was, too, it has to be admitted, something of a shell-shocked sluggishness in the American fleet after Pearl Harbor. We had thought the Japanese manufactured only cheap goods you bought in 10-cent stores, but now we became acquainted with their superb optics, the devastating Zero fighter, and what was later called the Long Lance torpedo. It took only a little while to learn that the Japanese were also first-rate in their courage and training. They were unsurpassed not only in gunnery and actions like fighting their ships at night, but, most significantly for our immediate future, in their magnificent aerial torpedo system. The crews chafed as American aircraft carriers, operating in task forces with fast cruisers and destroyers, were sent to the South Pacific to block a Japanese invasion of Australia. They were limited to a series of raids, quick in, quick out, against isolated Japanese bases far out in the Pacific, Marcus, Wake, and Kwajalein. At the beginning, we were not really ready for war, and these raids, punctuating long days of cruising, taught us the skills that would enable us to win, with some good luck, the Battle of Midway. It was amazing how long it took to get the hang of it and to react instantly in the right way. War, we gradually learned, is a state of mind before it can be anything else. The run into an island would begin at high speed the night before a raid, and the crew sweated in their bunks all night long, while the drive shafts, turning at high speed, rattled everything. Flight quarters came before daylight, and soon afterward general quarters was sounded. The ship turned into the wind to add nearly 30 knots, plus the wind, to the speed of the planes taking off. The first planes off were the fighters for the Combat Air Patrol, CAP, overhead, followed by the scout planes of the Anti-Submarine Patrol, ASP, to fly vectors, looking for enemy ships or subs. The radar antenna, one thing we had, courtesy of the British, that the Japanese did not, like a double-bed spring, rotated constantly on the mast top. Early radar was short-range and quirky, but it gave us a distinct advantage in knowing when unidentified planes were approaching. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, leader of the Pearl Harbor strike and of Kido Butai, the Japanese fleet of aircraft carriers at Midway, along with his commander-in-chief, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, were proud Japanese samurai. While we were making small raids, they were ranging over half the world. After devastating the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire went on in 6 months to destroy British naval power in the Far East by sinking the warships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaysia. They captured Singapore, raided Ceylon, and obliterated a combined Australian, Dutch, and American fleet off Indonesia, bringing down the old colonial empires of Britain and the Netherlands. Japanese troops were halfway across China, had stalemated the Russians in Manchuria, and soon forced Bataan and the fortress of Corregidor to surrender in the Philippines. Now, in early June 1942, the Navy was preparing to bring its ships to Midway Island, the westernmost American outpost remaining in the Pacific, intending to extend Japan's conquest to within 1,200 miles of Hawaii and draw out and sink any opposing American fleet. It was also said that the Japanese Navy was deeply embarrassed by the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in mid-April 1942, in sight of the Emperor's Palace, and was determined to ensure that the U.S. Navy could never approach Japan again. The Japanese Navy had begun to push in late April and May toward New Guinea and Australia to the south, and the Solomon Islands and Fiji to the east, with the aim of cutting off the United States from its allies down under, Australia and New Zealand. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, built around the two carriers Yorktown and the old warhorse Lexington, stopped the Japanese drive, sinking one small carrier and putting a larger one out of commission. However, the Lexington was sunk in the exchange, and the Yorktown was heavily damaged. When the Enterprise and Hornet of Task Force 16 arrived too late to get into the fight, the 3 remaining carriers were ordered to make a fast run back to Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise and Hornet arrived back in Pearl Harbor on May 26th. On May 27th, the Yorktown returned from the Coral Sea and went into dry dock. The Navy Yard worked miracles, repairing enough of the damage in 3 days to allow it to fight at Midway. All liberty was cancelled, and the reprovisioning and refuelling of the ships began immediately. Our admiral on the Big E, William Halsey, was tormented with a terrible allergic rash and was forced to go into the hospital. He was relieved as commander of Task Force 16 by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a line officer, not an aviator, who had been in command of a cruiser force. Rumours began to circulate that the Japanese were planning to invade Little Midway Atoll and draw our ships out to fight the great sea battle their strategy had long anticipated. Our information, we heard, came from codebreakers. Like troglodytes, the codebreakers inhabited a kind of underworld cellar, approached only by 2 locked doors and in a permanent state of shabby disorder, amid which heaped files and the ejections of IBM machines struggled, as the occupants were indeed doing, for survival. Commander Joseph Rochefort presided, in his ancient red smoking jacket and carpet slippers, a man driving himself to the limit on 2 or 3 hours of sleep and a diet of coffee and sandwiches. He slept on a cot among the squalor and had to be expelled to take a bath. A perfectionist, he allowed no message to leave Hypo, Hawaiian Code Center, until he himself had checked the translation. Unbelievably, the Japanese never realized throughout the entire war that their codes had been broken, and the U.S. Navy, equally blind, continued to believe that its ability to read one after another of the Japanese codes remained a deep, dark secret from its own sailors. But when the American carriers sailed from Pearl Harbor to the Battle of Midway, everyone aboard knew what was in the wind and how we knew it. Admiral Nagumo may have told his carrier sailors that the enemy lacks the will to fight, but the American Navy had been making itself ready for years to fight this, its greatest sea battle. There is something in a naval engagement that radically distinguishes it from one on land. The ocean at times has what is called its sea and its trough of the sea, but it has neither rivers, woods, banks, towns, nor mountains. In mild weather it is one hammered plain. Stratagems, like those of disciplined armies, ambuscades, like those of Indians, are impossible. All is clear, open, and fluent. The very element which sustains the combatants yields at the stroke of a feather. One wind and one tide operate upon all who engage here. This simplicity renders a battle between two men of war, with their huge white wings, more akin to the Miltonic contests of archangels than to the comparatively squalid tussles of earth. So our great American sailor writer, Herman Melville, described in Israel Potter, 1854, the nature of naval warfare as it was conceived and practiced until December 7, 1941, and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The American and Japanese aircraft carriers that steamed to the Battle of Midway left behind them in the fires and wreckage of Pearl Harbor not just a fleet of devastated ironclads, but an ancient mode of naval warfare in which for centuries battleships had thundered broadsides against battleships. Now aircraft carriers would be able to ambush unsuspecting enemies, and the crucial question for naval commanders from Pearl Harbor on had to be, where are the enemy carriers? Admiral Nimitz well understood the new strategy and tactics that December 7th enforced. Some of the Pearl Harbor battleships had been repaired by the time of Midway and were assembled in San Francisco Harbor, raring to go. But Nimitz left them there to their great chagrin. He knew they were too slow to keep up with 30-knot carrier task forces, and he also understood that their day had passed. They would serve in the long war to come for bombardment of assault beaches, and they slugged it out once in the Philippines in late October 1944 with equally obsolescent Japanese battleships. But the Pacific War featured fleet carrier task force against fleet carrier task force, and this type of warfare would first be displayed in its full dimensions at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, and then at Midway 1 month later. Though he had designed the Pearl Harbor attack that initiated carrier war, Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, never entirely understood the lesson he had taught. At Midway, which was also very much his operation, he continued to treat his carriers as an advance force for the big gun fleet he commanded from his flagship, the largest battleship in the world, the Yamato, named for the ancient Japanese kingdom. It weighed 63,000 tons, had 18-inch guns, and displayed the royal chrysanthemum on the bow. He placed his carriers several hundred miles in front of what he designated his main fleet, confidently planning to use them to clear the beaches for the invasion force and to draw out the American fleet for him to finish off with his big guns. His leading pilot, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, commented wryly after the war that at Midway, the officers and men of the big battle wagons were still confident that their massive firepower would win the war-ending battle when it came. Yamamoto's death after his defeat at Midway seemed almost designed finally to teach him the superior force of modern air power. In 1943, while on an aerial tour of his Solomon Island command, his plane was shot down by American fighters alerted to his schedule by the codebreakers in their Pearl Harbor basement who had set up his fall at Midway. In time, nuclear submarines armed with atomic missiles would displace the aircraft carrier as the world's first-line capital ship. But in the 1920s, the aircraft carrier was still considered an auxiliary to the main line of battleships, and the champions of air power, the visionaries of the Japanese and American navies, had to fight to design and construct them. The two countries competed directly with each other under conditions imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which attempted to limit the major naval powers of the world by setting a 5-5-3 tonnage ratio for the British, American, and Japanese navies. The Japanese, with growing imperial plans, were embittered by being treated as a lesser power, and at once began to rearm for the big battle they anticipated with the Yankee enemy, building new battleships and big carriers like Akagi, Redcastle, and Kaga, Increased Joy. At the outset, the Japanese, though advised by the British, who were leaders in carrier construction, were as uncertain as the Americans about the best design for their carriers, and modified them constantly as they learned what worked and didn't work. As first built, for example, Akagi had 3 separated vertically arranged flight decks, an upper landing deck 190 metres, 624 feet in length, a middle takeoff deck for fighters 18 metres, 60 feet long, and a 49-metre, 160-foot deck beneath that for launching torpedo bombers. Like the American carriers Lexington and Saratoga, Akagi and Kaga were built on unfinished hulls of battle cruisers that, had they been completed, would have exceeded allowed tonnage under the Washington Naval Treaty. Commissioned in 1927, Akagi, the Japanese carrier flagship, was loaded with features that suggested its origin as a battle cruiser. It was a big carrier, 36,000 tons to begin with, and later modifications brought its displacement up to just over 41,000 tons. It was 855 feet long and 102 feet wide after modifications, featuring that distinctive Japanese open look under the flight deck at either end. Its decks could carry 63 planes, while 131,000 horsepower drove its 4 shafts and moved the huge ship at 31.5 knots. A peacetime crew of 1,200 plus 800 air personnel manned the ship. Armament: 6 guns of 8-inch caliber were in casemates below the flight deck, 12 4.7-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 14 twin 25 mm along the deck. The Japanese flight decks had 45 mm wooden planks and 7 mm steel plates. Akagi was armoured with 10 inches of steel in a side belt, with a 3-inch armoured deck above the machinery. Kaga, commissioned in 1928, was patterned closely on Akagi. Originally, it too had 2 hangar decks and a long, open bow plus turrets for 8-inch guns. The upper hangar deck was later closed in the same way as Akagi, and its guns were moved to stern casemates to allow the extension of hangar and flight decks near the bow. It had a small island on the starboard side, and a trunk along the starboard side conveyed boiler gases aft. Hiryu, Flying Dragon, and Soryu, Deep Blue Ocean Dragon, the other Japanese midway carriers, were designed as carriers from the keel up and, though slightly smaller, resembled the Yorktown class of American carriers. Commissioned between 1937 and 1941, Yorktown, CV-5, Carrier, Heavier Than Air, No. 5, Enterprise, CV-6, and Hornet, CV-8, were the American carriers that would fight the Battle of Midway. They reflected the time in which they were built. When the naval budget in a time of deep depression could not pay for the new American carriers needed to stay even with the Japanese, and when many workers were unemployed, Yorktown and Enterprise were built with money provided by the National Industrial Recovery Act to provide jobs for those out of work. Many of the sailors aboard the ships were also there, as I was, because there were few jobs in Depression America. The ships belonged to their time in other ways as well. Together with their planes, the carriers represented an ongoing development of the Industrial Revolution, from massive machinery and brute applications of energy to more sophisticated technology. From coal to oil, from steam to electricity and hydraulics, from mechanics to electronics, from 2 operational dimensions to 3. The Lexington, the oldest of the first-line American carriers, with its huge General Electric turbo-electric drive, was able to provide power needed by Tacoma, Washington, for a month in 1929, when that city's electric plant went down. Within the American Navy, this technological shift was fought out in a running war beginning in the 1920s that did not end even with Pearl Harbor over the design of the new aircraft carriers. The old battleship Gun Club and the younger air power enthusiasts, the Airedales, known respectively for their footgear as the Black Shoe and the Brown Shoe navies slugged it out. The first American carriers built after the Great War, Lexington, CV-2, and Saratoga, CV-3, were huge ships built on top of the hulls of heavy surface warships. They retained many gun club features, such as heavy armor and 8-inch surface gun turrets on the flight deck. They were designed to fight it out with any cruisers that might attack them when they formed part of a battle line, or provided scouting for the main force of warships, which the old line admirals considered their primary function. The Yorktown carriers were, however, designed from the keel up as carriers, and embodied many of the ideas of naval aviators who saw aircraft and their carriers as an attack force in their own right, capable of operating independently of surface battleships. They were smaller than the earlier carriers, making it possible to build more under the Washington Treaty limits. Tremendous fights in the Bureau of Ships marked the design phase of these new-style carriers. Arguments raged about the thickness of the armor belt below the waterline, whether the carriers should carry heavy guns to defend themselves, and whether the flight deck should be steel or wood. At one point in the design phase, the Yorktown had a flight deck that ended short of the bow to allow room for a forward gun deck with 8-inch turrets. Underwater torpedo tubes appeared in one carrier design, but never reached the construction stage. What the aviators wanted above all was speed in their ships, and enough deck space to fly off their planes and land them safely and quickly. Speed to go into attacks and to get out again, speed to help launch planes by running into the wind, and speedy movement of the planes on deck to get maximum strikes into the air quickly. Speed was the desideratum, and the aviators got it in the Yorktown class, which varied in details but roughly conformed to a pattern. The flight deck was 800 feet long and 83 feet wide, broadened slightly opposite the island to facilitate easier plane handling when the amidships elevator, one of 3, was operating. Not fully loaded, they weighed about 20,000 tons and drew 26 feet of water. 9 boiler rooms fed geared steam turbines driving 4 shafts and moving the ships in trials at 32 or 33 knots. They were a few knots slower when loaded for combat, and their bottoms were fouled. Running at an economical speed of 15 knots, they had a range of 12,000 miles, but at high speed they burned fuel at a far faster rate, and in combat conditions needed to refuel every few days. A crew of 1,200 was needed to run them in peacetime, and considerably more, up to 3,000 in war when all battle stations had to be manned. Mostly the Brown Shoes got their design right, but at times they bungled. Early designs had arresting wires forward as well as aft, so that planes could be landed while the ship was reversing, since it was first thought that, depending on the wind, the carriers were as likely to launch and land planes while going backward as forward. A good idea, but it didn't work that way in practice. They also at first had transverse catapults forward on the hangar deck, so that planes could be launched through the open side curtains while air operations were proceeding independently on the flight deck. Both these features were removed in later refits. Guns? On this, the Brown Shoes were definite. Guns weighed a lot, and so those aboard the Yorktowns were all for protection against air attacks, with nothing really for surface defense. They were right. Only once during the war, at Leyte Gulf, did Japanese gunners get several escort carriers in their sights, and aircraft soon drove them off. 85/38 anti-aircraft guns were located in 4 sponsons at the corners of the flight deck. 4 quads of 1.1s, later Bofors 40mm, were fore and aft of the island on the flight deck, and 24 machine guns lined the flight deck catwalks, .50 caliber Brownings at first, but later upgraded to 20 Oerlikons. The number of guns and their placement were improved throughout the war, but they were never as effective against air attacks as the fighter planes of the Combat Air Patrol directed by radar. The main armament of the Yorktown carriers consisted of the 72 planes of an air group, though it was found that in the pressure of wartime operations, 80 or more could be handled efficiently. The mix was constantly changing, but at the time of Pearl Harbor, an American carrier air group was made up of 4 squadrons: a torpedo squadron, a fighter squadron, and 2 dive bomber squadrons, one designated for scouting and the other for bombing. The bombing and scouting squadrons used the same plane, the Douglas SBD Dauntless, and both squadrons became dive bombers for offensive purposes. That one squadron was designated for scouting, however, indicates the Navy's continuing emphasis on the importance of scouting. In contrast, the Japanese concentrated on attacking aboard their carriers and left scouting to the float planes on their escort vessels. At Midway, the destruction of the Japanese carriers can be traced to a scouting failure, while the Americans depended on land-based planes from Midway for the critical scouting reports. Optimally, there were 18 planes in each squadron, with a number of spares secured in the overhead of the hangar deck. After the war began, it was clear that more fighters were required to provide both the combat air patrols needed to protect the ships from enemy planes and the escorts needed to accompany the dive and torpedo bombers on their attack, so the fighter squadrons got bigger. However, the mix was considered critical, and the all-out coordinated strike on enemy ships that the Navy aimed for was designed to distract the target with dive bombers protected by fighters above, while the torpedo planes, also protected by fighters, came in on the surface to deliver the knockout blow. In view of what would happen at Midway, it is worthwhile to note that pilots recognized early on how difficult it was to coordinate such an attack, calling it a group grope. The art of handling the aircraft efficiently was developed by long practice and experience starting on the decks of the old Langley. The flight deck looked like a big war dance of different colours. The ordnance gang wore red cloth helmets strapped tight under the chin, and a red T-shirt when they went about their work of loading machine guns, fusing bombs, and hoisting torpedoes on cables to secure them to the bomb racks. Other specialties wore different colours. Brown for the plane captains, one attached to each plane and responsible for its safety at all times that it was not airborne. Green for the hydraulic men who manned the arresting gear and the catapults. Yellow for the landing signal officer, LSO, and deck control people, and purple for the oil and gas kings. It was all very colourful as crews swirled around, moving smartly, getting the planes in the right places, ready to go. Everything was on the double, taking place with whirling propellers everywhere, waiting to mangle the unwary. Crews of plane pushers in blue helmets and T-shirts ran, not walked, back and forth, in the days before there were deck tractors, pushing the planes on deck forward to allow those in the air to land. When the landing was complete, the planes forward were pushed back at a dead run to the stern so that they could be refueled and rearmed, ready to take off again. Planes needing work, engine repairs for example, were pushed onto one of the 3 huge elevators located forward, amidships and aft. The elevator warning horn would blow, sounding like the automobile horns of the 1930s. Ga-ooga! And a huge hole would open in the flight deck, lowering a plane to the hangar deck below, where metal curtains could be lowered at night and work could go on under the lights while maintaining the blackout that the ship operated under from dusk to dawn. Deck spotting was, if not a science, then a fine art on an American carrier, ensuring that the planes were in the right place to take off quickly, that returning planes could land before their gas was exhausted, all without having to clear the flight deck. Timing and speed were crucial, and the Japanese would lose at Midway in part because of failure to manage their flight decks efficiently. They had opted early on to keep flight decks clear for landing and takeoff, stowing all other planes on hangar decks. This limited the number of aircraft, 63 on the Akagi, to the number that could be parked on the hangar decks, 21 Zero fighters, 21 dive bombers, and 21 Kate torpedo planes. They were caught by American planes at the critical moment when they were unable to launch a strike against the American fleet, whose presence they had just discovered, because their flight decks were tied up launching and landing fighters to defend against attacking American torpedo planes. By the time war came at Pearl Harbor, the Brown Shoe Navy had the ships it wanted and had worked out ways to manage them and their aircraft effectively. When the ironclads could no longer provide the battle line, the aircraft carriers were there and ready to take their place. But the fate of these proud and seemingly invulnerable ships was built into them, not to become apparent until the Battle of Midway and the loss of the Yorktown. Armour and the location of the boilers were to be the critical matters. Much of the weight of a warship and its protection is in its armor plating. The Washington Treaty limited the weight of warships, which meant less armor or fewer ships. The Brown Shoes wanted as little armor as possible on their carriers, in order to maximize the number built and increase their speed and range. They would have liked to do without armor altogether, but in the end they were forced to accept a compromise. The Yorktowns had light 2.5- to -4- armor belts below the waterline, and an armoured deck of 1.5 inches just above the vital machinery spaces and the magazines, considerably less than the thickness of armour built into a warship designed for gunfighting. Wooden flight decks weighed less than steel, and the supports rising from the hangar deck could be lighter as well, so wood it was, though the British had shown its value in the Mediterranean. Lighter armour made the Yorktowns fast, above 30 knots in trials, but it also made them, it turned out, vulnerable to damage by torpedoes. In the first year of the war, 2 of the 3 Yorktown-class carriers were sunk by torpedoes. The USS Yorktown took 2 aerial torpedo hits and was abandoned, dead in the water, after a second attack on it at Midway. Reboarded, it was sunk a few days later by submarine torpedoes while under tow. The Wasp, similar in many ways to the Yorktowns but smaller and even more vulnerable, was sunk by submarine torpedoes near Guadalcanal. The Hornet canted sharply to starboard, water on its hangar deck, from aerial torpedo hits at Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942. It was later sunk by Japanese destroyer torpedoes after it refused to go down under a barrage of 5-inch gunfire from American destroyers. Enterprise alone of this class of ship survived to become the most famous warship of World War II. It was hit many times by bombs, but never by a torpedo. The official report on the sinking of the Hornet makes clear that the light armor plating in these ships had made them vulnerable to torpedoes. At the time of the design of this class of aircraft carrier, naval treaties imposed a limitation on size, which forced some sacrifices in torpedo protection, as compared with battleships, in order to gain other characteristics desired by the department. The transverse depth of the torpedo protection system was considerably less than is now considered necessary for protection against modern torpedoes. Exact evaluation of the protection afforded by any given system is only possible by means of full-scale tests in which the weight of the charge is accurately known. In the absence of such tests, extrapolations from 1/2 scale or smaller model tests is necessary, with considerable doubt in our present state of knowledge as to the scale factor. All of the information available to the Bureau, however, indicates that this system should have withstood a charge of about 500 pounds of TNT. The indication, therefore, is that the particular Japanese torpedo used in this case carried a larger charge, or a more powerful explosive, or both. Torpedo E is believed to have struck and detonated on the 4-inch special treatment steel side armor about 2 feet above the bottom of the plate. This conclusion is based on the location of the rupture in the holding bulkhead, as reported by an eyewitness. If this location is correct, the armor belt apparently did not have any very great effect in reducing the damage from the explosion. The thinness of the armor plating in this class of ships was, with unforeseen consequences, linked to another design flaw. The ideal flight deck would have had no obstructions on it anywhere, so that planes could be moved, landed, and launched without impediment. But a ship needed a bridge, as elevated as possible, and a flight control location, so there was always a need for some kind of an island structure on the flight deck. But what should be its size and location, port or starboard, fore or aft? The Japanese designers had the same problem, and never settled on a pattern, building small island structures of different sizes in various locations. At one point in their design, one carrier's bridge was even in the bow, just below the level of the flight deck. The American Navy, however, settled on large starboard amidships island structures, containing the bridge, the mast, and a single huge stack aft. With a large single stack available directly above, all 9 boiler rooms were then collected amidships, venting directly upward through the island stack, thus avoiding space-devouring trunks running through the ship, which would heat up hard-to-cool areas below deck. On some Japanese carriers, boiler gases were vented through a trunk flared downward, just below the flight deck, starboard amidships. On other ships, through a long horizontal stack running from amidships to the stern, just outside and below the flight deck. The Yorktown design seemed practical, but it violated the usual Navy arrangement of alternating boilers and machinery rooms to prevent all or most of the boilers and the steam power from being knocked out by a single torpedo or bomb hit. The Yorktown carriers, it emerged at Midway, with all boilers concentrated in one area, could go dead in the water with a hit from either bombs or torpedoes, while the rest of the propulsion machinery might still be functional. This is exactly what happened to the Yorktown at Midway. Aside from personnel casualties, the most serious effect of this bomb hit was that it ruptured the uptakes from boilers 1, 2 and 3, completely disabled boilers 2 and 3, and extinguished fires in boilers 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. The fire rooms containing all saturated boilers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 were filled with smoke and gases from the bomb hit and from the boilers themselves. A carrier that cannot move at high speeds while under air attack is a sitting duck, and this is exactly what happened in all Yorktown-class losses. Captain Charles Perry Mason of the Hornet, in his action report after his ship was sunk later in the year, was brief and explicit about what a single torpedo could do to these big ships. The key ship of a task force must not be completely disabled by one torpedo. The American Navy talked at the outbreak of the war as if its aircraft were the best in the world, but this confidence, insofar as it was real and not just bluster, was possible only because so little was known about the Japanese planes we would soon be fighting. The Japanese had been demonstrating the quality of their aircraft in China for a number of years, but just how little we knew is evident in the surprise of a naval pilot training as a carrier pilot in San Diego when he heard that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. If anyone should have known what the Japanese had in the way of planes, it should have been a carrier pilot who had just been through pilot training and was on his way to the Pacific Fleet. But on the day of Pearl Harbor, Fred Mears was startled to discover that he and his fellow pilots were totally ignorant of what they would shortly be facing. Suddenly we realized that nobody knew anything about the Japanese. We never had heard of a Zero then. What was the caliber of Japanese planes and airmen? What was the strength of the Japanese Navy? What kind of battles would be fought and where? Apparently we were woefully unprepared, lacking planes and ships, and the Japanese had struck hard. They had caught us in the landing circle with our flaps down. As if waking from a long sleep, we slowly became aware of facts that we hadn't thought about before. The Battle of the Coral Sea, just before Midway, had shocked the American Navy with what it revealed about both our planes and those of our enemy. Our fighter planes were inferior to the Japanese Zero, and our torpedo plane was obsolete. Only one of our carrier planes stood out. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber made by Douglas was the top of its line. Only these planes in the carrier air group had enough fuel to deal with the delays imposed by carrier warfare, still hit the enemy hard, and then return to their ships. The SBD-3 was in service by the first half of 1941 and was much praised by its pilots for its durability and flying qualities. With a 1,000 horsepower Wright Cyclone engine, it could fly 250 miles an hour and carry a 500, or a 1,000-pound bomb under the belly, plus 100-pounders under the wings. The Dauntless carried 2 men, a pilot and a radio-manned gunner, with 2 synchronized .50 caliber machine guns firing forward through the propeller, and 2.30 caliber free machine guns on a ring in the radioman's cockpit. With a loaded weight of slightly over 5 tons, it could reach 27,000 feet and had a range of about 1,300 miles. These are optimal figures, of course, provided by the makers from carefully controlled tests, and in service, few if any planes ever achieved their builders' ratings. However, the Dauntless could stay in the air for long periods. When Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey led the Enterprise dive bombers far past the point where the Japanese fleet had turned north, he had enough gas to conduct a search that eventually led him to his targets and brought him home, though with less than 5 gallons in his tank. The other carrier planes in service at Midway were less well adapted to their functions. the fate of the American torpedo planes at Midway was closely linked to the failure of the Grumman F-4F Wildcat shipboard fighter to handle its opponent, the Japanese Zero fighter. The F-4F-4 model was a mid-wing metal monoplane with manual retractable landing gear and backward-folding wings for carrier stowage. It had a wingspan of 38 feet, a length of 28 feet, 9 inches, a wing area of 260 square feet, and weighed 5,785 pounds when empty and 7,975 pounds when loaded for combat. The Wildcat had a power plant of a 200-horsepower Pratt and Whitney R1830-86 double-row radial engine, which gave it a maximum speed of 320 miles per hour at 19,800 feet. With this weight and its small wing surface, it had a wide turning radius and a slow climb rate, critical matters in combat with the very maneuverable Zero. The F-4F-4 model had 6.50 caliber machine guns in the wings, but could carry only 20 seconds of ammunition for each gun. The earlier model F-4F-3 had only 4 guns and fixed wings, but it was generally preferred because it could carry more ammunition per gun and, with less weight, could stay in the air longer. The Wildcat was stubby in design, looking like a bee, or, as someone put it less politely, a flying beer bottle. It guzzled gas at high RPM when climbing to high altitude, and its stated range of 845 miles was very optimistic. By the time it took off, circled for a bit to join up with other planes, and then flew 100 or so miles to an attack, it had only about a half hour of combat at full military power before it had to return to its carrier. But the Wildcat was rugged and would get home even when shot to pieces. The famous Thatch-Weave manoeuvre, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, made the best use of the Wildcat's heavy armament and its sturdy construction in air combat, but the weave was a defensive, not an offensive formation. The plane had been in development since 1940 and was the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation's effort to produce a naval fighter plane that could hold its own with any in the world. The Wildcat did not, but Grumman would soon produce its successor, the famous F-6F Hellcat, which entered service in 1943 and controlled the Pacific skies, along with the Vought F-4U Corsair for the remainder of the war. The Japanese Zero fighter was our nemesis. The Mitsubishi A-6M fighter, or Zeke as we called it, was the most famous of the Japanese military aircraft, and at the Battle of Midway, where the ship's anti-aircraft fire was comparatively ineffective, Zeke ruled the air, shooting down most of the American torpedo planes before they could get in range to drop their torpedoes. The Zero entered service in 1940, and by the time of Pearl Harbor, its expert, highly trained pilots had developed formidable fighter tactics. Modified throughout the war, the A-6M2 was the version that fought at Midway so effectively. It had a 950-horsepower Nakajima radial engine, and with a wingspan of 39 feet, it weighed just 3 tons. As in all the Japanese carrier aircraft, durability and safety were sacrificed to speed, maneuverability, and range. Pilots had no armor, and when hit heavily, Zeke, like all other Japanese planes, would usually burn because of light structural materials and the lack of self-sealing gas tank liners, but they were hard to hit. The Zero was not only maneuverable, it was fast, with a top speed of 331 miles per hour, and it could reach 16,000 feet in about 6 minutes, and then go on up to 32,000 or 33,000 feet. At cruising speed with the frequently used auxiliary tank, Zeke had a maximum range of nearly 2,000 miles, even with heavy armament. 220 mm cannon were in the wings, and there were 2 synchronized 7.7 mm machine guns. The machine guns were used for ranging, and the 20 mm for knockout shooting. A graceful plane, the design of Japan's greatest aeronautical engineer, Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero is remembered as the equal of the other great fighter planes of World War II, the British Spitfire, the German Messerschmitt 109, and the American P-51 Mustang. But it turned out to be vulnerable to the rugged, fast Hellcat once that plane appeared in the Pacific in 1943. Our fighters were at a disadvantage against their Japanese enemy, but the American torpedo plane was a real turkey. The TBD-1, torpedo bomber made by Douglas, Model 1, known as the Devastator, was the first all-metal carrier monoplane in the American fleet. It had been in service for nearly 5 years when the war started, but it was already obsolescent. Obsolete, really, though we didn't know it, or maybe just hadn't admitted it yet. The TBD-1 carried a torpedo externally, slanted forward and downward, and had a takeoff weight of nearly 10,000 pounds. A 900 horsepower twin-wasp radial engine gave it respectable numbers in the handbook, but in the fleet the numbers dropped alarmingly. The problem was evident in the landing characteristics of the plane, which, when it approached stalling, lacked the power to keep it from settling too rapidly. As a result, many pilots hit the ramp while landing on carriers. Worse still, loaded with a torpedo weighing over a ton, the old Devastator consumed between 30 and 50 gallons of fuel an hour, depending on its speed and climb rate, but could carry only a reduced amount of its maximum 180 gallons of gas. The problem of the reduced fuel in the tanks with a torpedo aboard cannot be overestimated, for it severely limited the pilot's ability to reach an enemy, make a combat run, and then get back to the ship. This issue was compounded when departure on a strike was delayed until the entire group was in the air and assembled. An unfavourable wind for launching burned up even more gas. Such were the conditions on the Hornet at Midway, and Waldron, knowing that he did not have the gas to return to the ship, planned to go on to Midway, a shorter distance after the attack. On June 4th, despite efforts to close on the Japanese fleet, the American carriers had to turn away from the Japanese so they could launch and land planes in a light southeasterly breeze throughout the day. Hinged wings folded over the TBD so that more of these planes could be accommodated on a carrier. The wings contained flotation bags with a lift of 3,400 pounds to keep the Devastator afloat and salvageable after water crashes, but the plane lacked self-sealing gas tanks, which made it vulnerable to fire at Midway. Carrying a crew of 3, pilot, observer, bombardier, and adioman gunner, Devastators had one synchronized .30 caliber machine gun firing forward through the propeller and a .30 caliber machine gun on a scarf ring for use by the radio man in the rear seat. After the war began, this after machine gun was changed to a dual mount that had more firepower, yet added more weight and was hard to handle in the slipstream. The landing gear was retractable hydraulically, but the lower half of the wheels still showed even when fully retracted, supposedly to assist in emergency landings. Loaded with bombs, the TBD could use the Norden bomb site as a horizontal bomber. It was never very effective in this role, but the Norden was the prize American secret weapon of the time. Bombs in pickle barrels from 10,000 feet, the U.S. Army Air Force bragged, and the Navy wanted it, even if it had to put the Norden on a relatively small plane like the TBD. The mid-seat observer was also the bombardier, and when the TBD was used as a high-level bomber, the bombardier crawled down from his seat, lay flat under the pilot, and aimed the bomb sight through a slanted forward window. Slow, with limited range, and lightly armed, the TBD's only plus was that it was extraordinarily stable, with a wingspan of 50 feet and a large wing surface of 422 square feet. The Navy knew the deficiencies of the Devastator, and a replacement, Grumman's TBF-1, became standard after Midway. A detached section of Torpedo Squadron 8 with 6 TBFs attacked the Japanese carriers from Midway Island, along with 4 Army Air Force B-26 Marauder medium bombers modified to carry a torpedo. Grumman soon turned the dies to make the TBFs over to General Motors, and from that time on they were known as TBMs, fondly called Muffies by the thousands of young men who flew in them. But at Midway, the TBF, for all its increased power, speed, and armament, fared no better than the TBD, for 5 out of the 6 that participated were shot down by Zeros, and the survivor was wrecked, its gunner dead, and its radio man wounded and unconscious. The Japanese torpedo bomber was much superior. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, known to us for identification purposes as Kate, was the workhorse of the Japanese carrier forces from 1940 until it became obsolescent in 1944. More of these stripped-down planes were sometimes included in a Japanese carrier air group than any other type, and they justified the faith placed in them, putting 3 American aircraft carriers, Lexington, Yorktown, and Hornet, out of action with torpedoes in the first year of the war. The B-5N2 had a 1,000 horsepower engine, weighed only 9,000 pounds loaded with a torpedo, and had a wing spread of slightly over 50 feet, which was reduced by half when the wings were folded overhead for storage on board a carrier. Its wheels were fully retractable. A loaded 200-mile range was optimally possible, as were speeds of 235 miles per hour and an altitude of 27,000 feet, though again these are builders' numbers. Lightly gunned, with only one after-machine gun, its main weapon was the Japanese aerial torpedo, not the famous long lance used on surface ships and submarines, but Type 91, Model 2, an oxygen-driven aerial torpedo, 18 feet long, with a 17.71-inch diameter, weighing 1,840 pounds. Kate could carry bombs of similar weight, and was often employed as a high-level bomber, using an aiming device to attack from level flight. Kate could be easily identified by the distinctive way it carried its torpedo or bomb, somewhat off-centre to starboard, in order to clear the sight line for a bombardier lying in the belly. American sailors came to hate to see Kate, having likely flown long distances, come over the horizon, for Kate's pilots were extremely skillful and courageous, resolutely pressing home their attacks with their very trustworthy plane and powerful torpedo. Just how aircraft design can affect operations shows up clearly in a contrast of the range of Japanese and American planes. Range figures have to be cut in half to allow carrier planes to go out to their target and then return to the carrier. So a 400-mile range, which might sound good, meant point-to-point, but for carrier operations meant a maximum 200-mile strike radius, without a safety factor. Further, the handbook ranges for both American and Japanese planes were optimals, and in practice in the fleet, ranges measured either by distance or by hours of flying time were greatly reduced by the realities of carrier flying. A carrier plane spent some time on deck, warming up and taxiing, burning gas all the time, before taking off at full power, gulping fuel. Once in the air, it might circle for up to an hour, getting into formation and waiting for other squadrons in the air group to get airborne and form up, before departing for the concerted group attack that was doctrine in both navies. This meant, in turn, staying together and required flying in formation, which needed a lot of throttle jockeying to maintain position, burning even more gas. Full military power during combat, with the throttle to the firewall, turning up high RPM, swallowed gasoline by the barrel. Then you had to turn around and go back to the carrier, circle while waiting your turn before landing, and then fly a long, roundabout approach. Many carrier planes came back aboard with thimblefuls of gas in their tanks. As a result of the limited range imposed by the realities of naval aviation and coordinated strike tactics, American carrier admirals preferred to launch an attack as close to the enemy as possible. At Midway, 155 miles was the distance between fleets at launch on June 4th, and Admiral Spruance would have preferred a distance of 100 miles. On some occasions in the war, such as at the Coral Sea, 170 miles, and at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when the risk was thought worth it, American commanders would go for longer distances, but when they did, not all the planes would make it back aboard. Range dramatically affected the fate of both the American torpedo planes and the performance of the fighters at Midway. On the morning of June 4th, at approximately 0600, when the American commander, Admiral Fletcher, knew for sure that the Japanese had been sighted, he ordered Spruance to begin moving west to close on the Japanese and launch the critical first strike as soon as they were definitely located. Fletcher may have intended locating the enemy and launching the strike to be simultaneous. The wording is ambiguous. Proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers as soon as definitely located. I will follow. But Spruance, not an aviator, chose, on the advice of his air staff, to close the enemy to lessen the distance for the attack, even after he had their exact location shortly after 0600. Distance was approximately 200 miles at that point, He launched everything available at about 0700, estimating the distance to the Japanese at 155 miles, hoping to catch the Japanese with their pants down. He was right, and his torpedo squadrons began to arrive, one after the other, just as the Japanese were recovering the last planes that had attacked Midway and were trying to ready their first strike against the newly discovered American fleet. A longer delay could have cost us either the battle or, which would have come to the same thing, our carriers. If the American aircraft, however, had been able to launch at 200 miles, as the Japanese could and did, Spruance would have gained a crucial half-hour on his enemies before they were aware of the American presence. Throughout the day, limited range affected our planes, particularly the fighters. Grumman Wildcats had about half the range of the Dauntless dive bombers, and in the 10-plane Fighting 8 detachment from the Hornet, every plane ran out of gas and landed in the sea without ever sighting the enemy. The fighters from the Enterprise, Fighting Squadron 6, circled above the Japanese fleet for a time, but left the scene of the battle without engaging the enemy because they were short of gas. 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 off the Yorktown gave Torpedo Squadron 3 the only fighter protection afforded torpedo planes that day, but they broke off after mixing it up with the Zeros and losing a plane. When Jimmy Thatch called for the survivors of this group to rendezvous, Ensign, later Commander Tom Cheek, was unable to go to the rally point 20 miles north because to get there would take fuel that I did not have to spare. With their lighter planes and bigger fuel tanks, plus auxiliary drop tanks on the Zeros, which our planes did not have at Midway, the Japanese were much less limited in the distance at which they could launch strikes. Zero fighters based in Formosa, Taiwan, at the beginning of the war, were able to fly to Luzon, fight there, and return to their home fields. At 0430 on June 4th, the Japanese launched their strike on Midway Island at 200 miles. At 0859, the last of them landed back on their ships, the fighters having engaged in combat along the way, and the bombers having attacked the Midway defences. Their scouts, except for an older plane with low fuel capacity from a battleship, were able at the end of a 300-mile vector out to make a 60-mile dogleg flight and then return 300 miles or more to their home ships. Some were able at Midway to remain over the American fleet for a good part of the day, sending crucial reports back to their carriers. Design differences were not the results of chance or fashion, but reflected differing national attitudes toward war and the value of individual life. Where we chose ruggedness and safety for the flyers, to put it simply, the Japanese opted for performance and distance, sacrificing crew safety and endurance to achieve these goals. No design details are more telling in this regard than the absence in Japanese planes of armour behind the pilot and of self-sealing gas tanks. In contrast, American pilots and aircrews loved our planes for the armour that protected them, the self-sealing tanks, and the way the plane's rugged construction would bring you home even after heavy damage. But the price paid for valuing life over performance was that our planes at the beginning of the war were outclassed by their Japanese opponents, which could fly much faster and farther. Later in the war, more powerful engines made it possible to build faster American planes without sacrificing their safety features. But at the time of Midway, our planes were not as fast or maneuverable as the Japanese, and their range was comparatively limited by their weight and fuel capacity. Navies were very high on torpedo planes as ship killers at the time of the Midway battle. At Taranto on November 11, 1940, the British, flying an obsolescent, very slow biplane, the Fairy Swordfish, known as the String Bag, went into a harbour in the south of Italy at night and crippled the Italian fleet, flying straight and level to within 700 feet of the targets. They repeated their success at the sinking of the German super battleship Bismarck in May 1941, when, flying in unbelievably bad weather, they put a torpedo into it that locked its steering gear and forced it to steam in circles, making it an easy prey for the warships that then came up and sank it with gunfire. The great aerial torpedo attack of all time, however, was the Japanese assault at Pearl Harbor. Japan sent in 40 planes carrying torpedoes and got 19 hits and 19 explosions. The targets were, of course, tied up and unprepared for an attack, but the number of hits was still very impressive, especially in water that was shallower than optimal. For all the reputation torpedoes had, the American versions had many problems. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo dated from the early 1930s. It was stubby, 13 feet 5 inches long and 22.4 inches in diameter, and heavy, weighing 2,216 pounds. Its warhead originally contained 400 pounds of TNT, later 600 pounds of Torpex, which gave it more bang but made it nose-heavy. Its speed was 33 knots, with a short range. Like most torpedoes at that time, it was a self-contained, small, steam-propelled submarine. The warhead, with a built-in exploder, was mounted forward of an air flask filled with compressed air that forced alcohol, which is where some lucky old salts got their shipboard alky, and water together in a combustion chamber to make the steam that drove the turbine and the propulsion system. The tail had the control fins and 2 propellers controlling torque by turning in opposite directions. Gyroscopes and guidance mechanisms were in the after section to control depth and direction. Much that was wrong with the American torpedo delivery system was widely known before the war, but, despite remaining problems, in the spring of 1941, officialdom pronounced the Mk-13 an all-up round, with estimates of 80% reliability when dropped from 140 feet altitude. The Ordnance Bureau's assessment proved absurd. Fleet squadrons, which knew better, limited drop parameters to a maximum of 110 knots at 50 feet or less, severely limiting torpedo tactics. One history says that the torpedoes had 12 major defects and remarks. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the performance of the Mark 13 was so bad, until finally improved in 1944, as to make American torpedo plane attacks well-nigh futile. The problems grew with the training, or lack thereof, of the pilots to drop torpedoes. When George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, went up on the deck of the Hornet on June 4, 1942, to get into his TBD and fly off to attack the Japanese fleet, he had never flown a plane with a torpedo on board, let alone dropped one. He had never even seen a plane with a torpedo take off from a carrier. Well, Torpedo 8 had a difficult problem. We had old planes, and we were new in the organization. We had a dual job of not only training a squadron of boot ensigns, of which I was one, of course, but we also had to fight the war at the same time. When we finally got up to the Battle of Midway, it was the first time I had ever carried a torpedo on an aircraft, and it was the first time I had ever taken a torpedo off of a ship. I had never even seen it done. None of the other ensigns in the squadron had either. The pilots of Torpedo 8 had flown 2 or 3 torpedo drop training flights a month, to judge from the flight log of another young squadron pilot, Ensign Grant Teets, but neither real nor dummy torpedoes were carried on these practice runs. The drops were simulated with smoke bombs marking the point of release. Torpedo 8 was a new squadron, with many barely trained new pilots and radio gunners who knew Morse but had no gunnery instruction. The squadron had been formed in the summer of 1941 to go on board the Hornet when it was commissioned later in the year. But old hands in torpedo planes didn't have a lot more experience, and perhaps even less trust in their weapon. Simulated torpedo runs were seldom carried out other than during fleet problems or local manoeuvres. Once a year, each pilot was to make a live drop with a dummy head on a real torpedo. There was no practice scheduled using cement logs such as evolved later. We made no drops in 1939. In 1940, we made 2 dry runs on a regular target towed by a minesweeper or tug, then the big day, taking off from North Island with a Mk-13 hanging out of the bomb bay. On the first live drop, the fish dropped clean. It ran true for the first 100–150 yards, then veered 60 degrees to port and took off over the surface like a happy trout. From the scuttlebutt going the rounds at Pearl, ours was not an isolated incident with torpedo drops. All the available evidence is that the Bureau of Ordnance and Bureau of Aeronautics had more than adequate warning as to what was going to see as torpedo armament. There was a chronic torpedo supply shortage that had its roots, as so many Navy dispositions did, in turf and politics. The single pre-war naval torpedo factory at Newport, Rhode Island, on Goat Island in Narragansett Bay, was an old-fashioned facility where a lot of the parts were made slowly, and not always interchangeably, by hand. This factory fiercely defended its monopoly and, supported by the Rhode Island Congressional Group, reacted angrily to any criticism. As a result, we went into the war with a handcraft method of producing torpedoes and an inadequate supply of them that was not remedied until after a second factory was reopened later in the war in Alexandria, Virginia, still against the fierce opposition of Goat Island. The chronic shortage that resulted from this situation was what gave torpedo plane pilots such rare chances to practice with a torpedo. Additionally, torpedoes were so expensive, about $10,000 apiece, that a Navy with an annual budget of around $350 million during the Depression years of the 1930s practiced with them very infrequently and only with the greatest care, lest they be damaged or lost. Even the old hands in the air groups and on the submarines had never made a war shot. When World War II began, there was no one in the Navy who had ever seen or heard a torpedo detonate. Those who flew at Midway were not surprisingly unsure of just what they had done or should do while trying to hit a Japanese carrier at Midway with a torpedo. Here is a gunner's description of the confusion about the crucial issue in his plane. I was not aware or did not feel the torpedo drop, probably because Call, the pilot, was turning and trying to jinx sick a little bit. A few days later, I asked him when he dropped. He said that when he realized that we seemed to be the only TBD still flying, and that we didn't have a chance of carrying the torpedo to normal drop distance, he dropped at greater than normal range. At about this time, probably, I couldn't figure out what he was trying to do. The flak was really bad, so I yelled into the intercom, "Let's get the hell out of here!" It is possible that my yell helped him make his decision. Gay knew so little about his weapon that he couldn't even properly identify the kind of torpedo he had under his plane. We had torpedo planes, but we had to use old submarine torpedoes. It wasn't as bad as that. The torpedo squadrons were using the standard American aerial torpedo, the Mark 13, but experience with it after the war began added to the general feeling of nervousness about the weapon. The famous Jimmy Thatch told of watching in crystal-clear water our torpedoes in an early attack in New Guinea run under their targets only to explode spontaneously on the other side or bury themselves in a mudbank. At Tulagi on May 3, 1942, 22 torpedo planes got just one hit against very light opposition. Things looked better a few days later, on May 6th, when some 6 or 7 torpedoes from Lexington and Yorktown planes were reported to have hit the light carrier Shoho. But 2 days after that, in an attack on the big fleet carrier Shokaku, 21 devastators from the Lexington and Yorktown launched 20 torpedoes, and all missed. The Japanese noted that the torpedoes had been launched from too far out, and that they ran so slowly in the water as to be easily avoidable. They were also avoidable because, using air for pressure, they gave off a track of hydrogen bubbles that revealed their path. American aviators on this strike blamed the failure on the slow speed of the TBD, which surely ought to have been no surprise to them by that time, and erratic behavior by their torpedoes. But the Japanese, who at this point in the war were openly contemptuous of the Americans and their equipment, were right. The main troubles were with pilots who nervously dropped torpedoes too soon, which ran too slowly. Lieutenant J.G. Robert E. Laub, one of the few survivors of Torpedo 6 at Midway, spelled out the consequences of the slow speed of the Mark 13. To have a reasonable chance of obtaining a hit on a ship capable of making 25-30 knots with our present aircraft torpedo, the point of dropping must be at a target angle no greater than 70 degrees on either bow end at a range of approximately 800 yards. The reason for this statement is obvious when the fact that our aircraft torpedo has a maximum speed of 33.5 plus or minus 0.5 knots is considered. Any drop which the attacked ship can cause to be a trailing shot has practically no chance of hitting the target due to the respective speeds. In other words, the torpedo will probably never reach the target before it runs out and stops. At high speeds, the leads necessary are so large that even at 800 yards range, a slight misjudging of the target's speed or lead to be given will result in a miss. High-speed targets are the only targets discussed because, in a task force containing carriers, no attacks will be made on any other ships except the carriers, while one is still afloat, and all carriers are capable of a 25-30 knot speed. Given the deficiencies of the American torpedoes, a day of terrible failure was sooner or later inevitable. It came at Midway. With not a single explosion, the few torpedoes that were dropped there before the planes were shot down were as ineffective as George Gay and his fellow pilots had heard and believed, before they lugged them out to the Japanese fleet. We had built and installed what we called stator vanes. This was a big plywood bomb tail that we hoped would give the thing some aerodynamic characteristics and enable it to enter the water without going end over end. I don't know whether mine went in right, ran true and got a hit, or whether it went straight to the bottom. It may have turned around and gone back to Pearl Harbor for all I know. What I know for sure is that I tried. The Japanese torpedoes were almost exactly twice as good as ours were at this time. They could drop them twice as high and fast, and then count on them running almost twice as fast.